just a quick intro. I just want to say I apologize for the audio quality. For some reason, Skype decided to give me a little slapback echo this time around. So I apologize for that, but please enjoy this interview with Henry Warwick. Okay, this week we have a very special guest. I've known this guy for ages, it seems. We originally got to know each other through this weird set of people in San Francisco who were kind of into technology and video gaming, but got together on the Severed Heads mailing list.
Yeah, that was great fun back then, man.
That was great fun. And then subsequently, I ran a little website kind of in the earlier days of the internet called Creative Synth, and Henry,
it was a great magazine. Yeah,
Henry was the wrote about creative options for the magazine. He was like my personal fref, maybe. So this is Henry Warwick. He
Hi.
is. Hi. Yeah, I guess you've introduced yourself already, so there you go. But he's a professor at Ryerson up in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
But he is also probably the most multimedia people I know. Going back to the day, I remember that he was simultaneously working on album releases. He had this series of paintings and kind of sculptural paintings that used gold leaf, which were obviously very expensive to create. And they always had stories behind them. And I always liked talking to Henry about his artistic work because the stories behind them were just fascinating. And his thought processes were equally fascinating. And so I'm really excited to be able to introduce you, the listeners, to my friend Henry Warwick.
Hi,
right, Henry.
Thanks for that. That's awesome.
Well, it's I mean, I realized when I was thinking about it, I realized that we actually have a really long, but maybe kind of shallow history. I mean, the stuff we did together at Creative Synth was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was great fun. And then I decided to go to grad school.
Yeah, and then, right, you fell off the edge of the earth as part of that process, which I guess grad school does, right?
Well, it was everything. There was a grad school, so I got my MFA. My job situation got really sketchy. And I was just running around and doing like a lot of really crazy stuff. And and then I think, didn't you move at that point too?
Yeah, that was when I moved from Wisconsin out to beautiful Denver, Boulder area.
Yeah. So we both, went through a lot of transitions and
big shakeup.
Yeah. But it was a good time, and I got my MFA. Now I have a PhD. Ooh.
I know, you're scary.
I'm Dr. Warwick to you, buddy.
Well, that's funny because like all of your, I mean, I shouldn't say this because people now can probably like hunt you down and hack you. But all of your stuff is your names for your mailing, your email and stuff are all Mr. Warwick. And I'm always like, shouldn't that be Dr. Warwick now?
That's a good idea. I didn't think of that. Wow.
Yeah,
I need to get a new email address.
Right.
Dr. Warwick.
So I introduced you as the most multimedia artists. Why don't you explain to the listeners what I mean? Tell me all the things you've got going right now.
Okay, well, let's see. What I have next in the hopper is, is a piece called Data Field. It's up to version 2 and version 3, and that's going to be part of the Transmedial exhibit in Berlin at the end of January. And Data Field 2 is basically one of these network-attached storage units. I bought one from Seagate. They're pretty amazing. It has a terabyte of storage, and it's battery-operated. And it'll broadcast through Wi-Fi on its battery pack for 10 hours. So I will simply have that thing in my pocket. And the thing about what makes Datafield interesting is that it's a curated selection of books that I developed for my PhD called the Alexandria Project. It's basically an entire library, okay? And that's a very interesting thing because now libraries can be these objects in your hands, like full blown, like tens and tens of thousands of books, like right there available to you. And so that's Data Field 2. It uses the standard Seagate interface, so it's kind of weak that way,
Right.
and that's going to be probably part of Data Field 4. Data Field 3 consists of a set of USB sticks, and these will also have many books on them. However, the difference is that these will all be internally indexed. And so if you have a Windows machine, you can use that index. It's a system called Dropout. It's based on the Lucene engine, which is developed in Java, but it only works on Windows because the guy who developed Dropout works for Codeplex or something like that at Microsoft, and so it'll only work on Windows. But that's okay. It's the next step, you see, from just a big pile of books. So Data Field 2 is the giant pile of books available to anybody, but you only get to search by, file title and stuff. And then the next level is to use an indexing system that allows you to read inside the books and then do actual genuine research. And that's kind of where I want to go with that, is to develop a full-blown giant library of indexable books that's completely offline. And that offline element is really important to me because, as we've seen, thanks to, going back to like Egypt, when they shut the internet off, it's very clear that the internet is no longer this rhizomatic system that can, work around any kind of errors or holes. It's clearly a very arboretic system. It's fragile, and it can be chopped down and stopped.
Yeah, and it's especially chopped down and stopped by the government agencies that provide us the access.
Right, and that's just the most draconian thing about it. But also, that doesn't include the people who have private interests.
Right.
Okay. See, because that's the other flip side, is that it isn't just quote unquote these big evil governments unquote. It's also these corporations that are seeking to completely cordon off and fence and enclose and then extract the wealth that is of the internet. And so there's this whole thing about shaping, people's ability to download stuff. So if you go to a certain website, it might not work as well.
Right.
That kind of thing. And that I find that's even spookier. You see, because if you're facing an implacable government enemy, well, you know how to work around it. There's dead drops, there's offline stuff. There's ways to deal with that.
Well, there's decades of history of subverting governments.
Exactly.
Right.
But there is not this same level of subversion, shall we say, or avoidance of the corporation. See, it's only recently, since like World War II, that corporations have become, these giant monstrosities equal to governments.
Right.
And so that's the flip side. And I see actually a lot of opposition to these kinds of offline libraries, not so much as people trying to stop them directly, but by simply evading the necessity for them. So, for instance, if you look at your typical iPad, you cannot plug a USB drive into it. You can plug your iPad into your computer and then transfer files onto it. But the iPad itself doesn't really have the ability to view these files, as a drive. See what I mean? It doesn't really boot that.
Sure.
So that's a very interesting thing. So what that is it's an end run around the offline.
Oh, right.
And it makes people much more dependent on the online. So your computer becomes basically like what what's his face from Oracle was always dreaming about. Your computer is just a dumb terminal.
Right.
And that's kind of what an iPad is. It's just a dumb terminal for entertainment.
Right.
So that's the kind of stuff that data field. That's the political field of data field, and that's what we're working with on there. The other thing that I'm working on, well, I just finished last year, was NC Performer. It's a piece of software that I designed that plays NC by Terry Riley on an iPad. And it's really pretty extraordinary. I'm presently working on an article that's a response to another article by a guy named Guerreria. And he did a really kind of wonderful in-depth discussion about what my software means. I did not write the software. It was written by Matt Ingalls, who's an absolutely brilliant programmer in the Bay Area. And he's also a wonderful, wonderful avant-garde clarinetist. And he's part of the SF Sound group who bring avant-garde music to the SF Bay Area. Right. And so he's a cool guy, and he had lots of great ideas that he also brought to the table. So I basically got a grant and had this developed by him. And so now you can download the software. It's called NC Performer. You can download it from the Apple iPad App Store, and bingo, you can play NC all on your own. It kicks out MIDI, so you can attach it to your laptop or a big bank of synthesizers, whatever, flips your crank, and that's a really wonderful thing. And I've been touring all over with that. I played in the Vortex Room in San Francisco, and then the Uptown Club in Oakland. And then I played at AS220 with Alan Sondheim in Providence, Rhode Island. And then I played in New York City at the New School for Social Research. And I played at the Double Double Land here in Toronto. And I'm going to be playing in Werkstatt in Berlin at the end of January.
Wow. That's cool.
Yeah. So that's been really active too.
Well, and in doing my prep research, I see that you have a book out there.
Yeah.
Radical Tactics of the Offline Library. Is this related to that data field project?
Yeah. The data field project grows out of the personal portable library because fundamentally that's exactly what data field is. It's a personal portable library that's simply been attached to a Wi-Fi.
Got it.
That's what Data Field 2 is. Data Field 3, the little USB sticks are even more direct to that question of the personal portable library. Because, damn, there ain't nothing more portable than a USB stick.
Good point. I mean, and if you think about it, again, kind of from the subversion angle, not only is it portable, but it's hideable. Mm-hmm. And its external vision doesn't imply the internal content.
Exactly. It's just anonymous USB key. And so there's a lot of stuff that's really around that that data field brings into play. The personal portable library, the book, does a lot more than just discuss that. It also discusses the reason why this is important. You see, libraries, this is all part of my PhD research. Uh-huh. My PhD research was called the Alexandria Project, where I built my first giant, ebook library. It was like 50,000 books or something like that. And on a single drive, and I alphabetized it by author.
Sure.
The personal portable library comes out of a traditional, and I mean super traditional, sense of what a library used to be. Prior to the invention of the printing press, the library was just a giant Xerox machine. Only instead of, photostatic drums copying stuff, it was people with quill pens and ink. Uh-huh. And they spent all of their days copying books because the books would rot. Right. They would fall apart. And so the whole thing about the library was not only was it a copy machine, but it was also a center of learning. Mm-hmm. Now, with the invention of the printing press, questions of copyright and property came into focus. And because of the the sunk cost of building a printing press. The the flip side is though is that the libraries ceased to be copy centers and they became warehouses. And there's a big difference between a warehouse of knowledge and a center of learning.
Right.
And so now with the personal portable library, a scholar can now collect their books and then index them and then be able to see inside the books the information that they wanted. So one of my examples was how often does Marx talk about nature, like capital N, nature, in Capital Volume 3? I don't know. That's a good question. That's a scholarly question,
Right.
It's a 700-page book.
Right.
You might as well just jump out a window if you're going to do that. That's like so boring. It's like dreadful. Oh, God. Every single page scanning down. Oh, there's nature, but it's not capital N. He's talking about the nature of the proletariat or something. No, I want to talk about nature. So you got to go through the whole damn book, page after page after page, then do it again to make sure that you didn't miss anything. Okay. You'll go insane. And then every time you find one, you got to write it down on a little index card and then jot down the sentence, right?
Right.
And so you end up with a stack of index cards. That could take you months. That's just weeks of labor. So what I did was I had that. I opened it up in, Acrobat, Command F to find capital N nature. I found, I think 37 moments where Marx talked about that. And then I was able to copy and paste the paragraphs that it occurred in from the PDF into MS Word. And then I was able to assemble all of that in about 40 minutes. And I took about a 5-minute break to go get a can of beer out of the fridge.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's kind of interesting because what you're doing with that project then is basically saying scholarly access to this data combined with sort of like the grinder capabilities of a computer, but not being dependent on external access.
Right.
It means that you have sort of this focused but also maybe honest way of doing your research. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I've been working on is that. So next year, my plan is to apply for a really huge grant, like as in many, many zeros,
Okay.
as in more than 3 or 4.
Right.
And
yeah, I seem to always get 2 zeros in my grants, so I have work to do.
you understand. So if I can get that money, then what I want to do is hire programmers to build because Lucene, the Lucene engine from Apache is built in Java. So there's absolutely no reason why it isn't completely cross-platform.
Right.
The only reason why it's not is because its present implementation by that programmer at Microsoft is because it only works in Windows,
right.
And in the form of what's called Dropout. So he built this program Dropout using the Lucene engine. The Lucene engine, as I said, is built in Java, so there's absolutely no reason why it can't work on Linux, Windows, Mac, whatever floats your boat.
Sure.
So my goal is to be able to build that front end for these kinds of offline libraries. And that would absolutely revolutionize so many different things, because then any student could then have a drive like this. They wouldn't be dependent on getting online. They could do it in their car, on the bus, on the train, whatever. And they'd be able to do their research as a student or as a scholar, as a professor, and be able to do all this work offline.
Right.
And then the idea is that they'd be able to search for these terms and be able to develop their documentation extremely quickly. That would be a revolution.
Yeah. That's incredible.
So that's what I'm thinking about now. That's my plans for next year. In terms of data field and the personal portable library, data field becomes a work of art because it's basically really experimental and edgy. I mean, there's this. I have absolutely no confidence this is going to work at all. I mean, it's commercial grade stuff. It's consumer junk. For all I know, three people will get on and it'll crash its little internal server.
Right.
And so who knows? We will find out. That's the beauty of art. It's like opening yourself up to these frailties and to these risks.
Yeah, well, that's, I guess, the difference between what you're doing and sort of like a data processing indexing type thing is that there is risk. I always feel like risk is one of the indicators of art.
Mm-hmm.
But also, there's this sense of again of subversion and sort of like a multi-headedness to it that does make it artful. So that's really cool. But getting back to some of the things you've done, in addition to all these things, you also have over the years done several audio/musical releases.
Oh yeah, I have one that just came out this year.
Okay.
Called Something Borrowed, and it's a pretty crazy piece of music. It's a piece made out of other pieces of music.
So you're like DJ Shadow here.
No. It's although that's a kind of an interesting idea. It's just that there's no beats involved.
Right.
So I take the doof out. It starts with it's also kind of a compilation because I've been working this way for a while, ever since you introduced me to Ableton Live back in before it even came out.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, I do. I was kind of like a pusher with the new drug when that first came out, I have to admit.
Oh, it's awesome. It's still my main tool to this day. It's really great. But the thing is, of course, is that it operates as a sample-based system. There's all these things that you could... It also has, of course, built-in synthesizers and stuff now.
Right.
But fundamentally, it's a way of playing sound parts. And so that's been my main way of using it. The thing that I started with for Something Borrowed picks up where my other records left off. They also used samples, but I also did a lot of like just direct keyboard playing on them as well. Mm-hmm. This one, there's almost no keyboard playing at all. There's just like a couple points where I just couldn't find samples that would fit properly, so I played something. But it starts with a thing called Old Friends. And that's basically means that all of the samples that I used play together with each other more than once. So like I got this sample library from this really cheesy piece of you can make techno in your bedroom kind of software.
Right.
And I just pulled all the samples out of it, and then I used them and processed them. And built that, and then it goes through this process. So it starts with Old Friends, and then there's Snow in June, which sort of prefaces the whole discussion.
Uh-huh.
So now it's Snow in June, which actually happened to me when I was getting my PhD. It was in Switzerland, and it actually snowed in June, and I was like completely blown away. But then we went to then there's a piece called Civic. And then New Friends, where the samples don't talk to each other more than once. They only meet each other once. Okay. And then there's White Mountain, which builds off of Snow in June. And the next piece is called Mitigations. And the last piece is called A Darker Ecology. And this has a lot to do with my interests in ecology and the Anthropocene, which is the... geological period that many scientists believe we are now in. We used to be in an era called the Holocene, which was the era after the last ice age. Now we're in a completely new period that's best described as the period where humans have become a part of the geological record.
Right.
It starts with a very fine carbon layer that began in the year 1800 or right around then, which is basically when the steam engine was basically perfected. And so all the coal and wood was suddenly all over the world being burned and dumped and deposited in this geological layer. Then that gradually increased until 1945, when at that point in the geological layer there is a residue of radioactive material from the obviously from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of test explosions. Yeah. So now the planet is covered with this thin layer of radioactive material, and also the carbon, the level of carbon has skyrocketed. And so this is all being dumped into the geological record. And so this is why we are now in a new geological period, which is characterized by increased temperatures, increased amounts of carbon deposited, and a decrease in the number and variety of life forms. So we're in not only is the temperature going up, but we're also in the middle of a giant extinction event. So these are the kinds of that's the kind of content that's involved with the piece Something Borrowed. The next thing I'm doing is this year I'll be doing a record called Something Old and Something New. And that came out of a thing where this girlfriend of mine from the mid-'80s, I hadn't seen her in years and years and years. And she found me on Facebook. And so we talked, and she said, "Hey, you remember those cassettes you sent me? I still have them." And I'm like, "No, I really don't remember those." "Oh, right." So she sent them back. And I digitized them and put put them on CDs for her, and put CD covers. They did a really nice job, packaging it for her and sent it back. But the interesting thing is that one of the tapes has my earliest recordings from like 1986. So those were also digitized, and I compressed them a little bit to make them sound, a little more meatier because they're pretty thin. I did some noise reduction, that kind of thing. And that becomes the Something Old part of the CD, of the release. The Something New part is something that builds out of Something Borrowed, where not only am I borrowing stuff, but I'm pretty much doing direct remixing of not just the sound, because the sound to me isn't that interesting, but the composition itself. So what I do is I take a piece, say, Mysterious Semblance at the Strand of Nightmares by Tangerine Dream, okay? And then I feed that into Ableton Live, and then I turn on Ableton Live's harmony detector, which is terrible. I mean, it really, really doesn't work. But that's perfect, because this comes from a kind of glitch aesthetic for me. It's what Kim Cascone talked about in his piece Aesthetics of Failure, where it's no longer interesting to play with digital technology. We're now in a post-digital state where even the failures of digital technology can be used creatively. And back when he wrote this in 1999, he was obviously looking at people like Oval and Pansonic and people like that, who would, take stuff like scratched CDs or cable hum
right,
and turn it into music. I'm coming from that kind of perspective with this, where only the failure isn't the mechanical part of the digital technology, as in just overloading a digital preamp and getting it all crunchy. It's more just the fact that the software doesn't work right.
Right.
And this becomes, so what happens is the software makes decisions for me. And then what I can do is I can go in and edit its decisions. And so this way, what used to be Mysterious Semblance at the Strand of Nightmares by Tangerine Dream becomes this piece that I call Phaedral because it's from the album Phaedra. And so Phaedral is this, you can sort of detect parts of the song. I mean, it makes sort of sense. You can sort of feel the old piece, but but none of the melodies there. It's all turned into this digital mash.
Well, and also at that point, you can kind of re-instrument it and everything, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, the original was on synthesizers, but primarily just this giant wonkin Mellotron 400 set. Oh, actually, two of them set to strings.
Right.
And so Frozie's just there, like banging out these string sounds. I reset it to do electric piano. So it suddenly becomes, so instead of like this grand haunting thing, like space music from Jupiter, it's more this kind of gentle and private and very intimate piece of music on this kind of tinkly electric piano. It's a completely different feel, and it's a very different thing. So in this way, I haven't composed anything. All I did was process data,
Right.
and I've come up with a new piece of music. And this goes to people like what's his name, Goldsmith, Kenny Goldsmith, who talks about the uncreative art. Mm-hmm. His whole thing is to literally retype books. He'll just take a book and retype the whole thing. Another thing he did was called, soliloquy, where he recorded everything that he said for a week and then typed it. And that became the book.
Interesting.
So you see what I mean? So it's not creative at all. There's no creativity in this period. He's just typing what he sees or what he hears, and it becomes a text. With this, what I'm doing is I'm just taking music that I select. So I guess there's something creative in that, but that's just more having been alive for all these years and listening to lots of music,
right.
Being able to curate, and then put that into this machine, which then interprets it in the worst possible way.
Well, it's true, but I mean, if you think about it, one of the aesthetics that is starting to occur is sort of the rejection of randomness. I'm starting to hear more and more people's, if they criticize something, they'll criticize it for being too overtly random.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because people are finding places like this where there's some randomness just because of the glitchiness of the system, but it still has a basis that's non-random, and also there's an editing process that's non-random, which is that you go in and you say, I prefer this portion of it to that portion. Mm-hmm. I like the direction this goes, and I like linking it to the direction something else goes. So while at its heart it may be built off of glitch and a kind of randomness, it also is sort of a rejection of pure randomness as the art form.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I also think that there's a general movement away from the avant-garde, the 20th century avant-garde, because music has specific effects. Now, these effects may be socially determined, so they may not be, how should you say, they're not necessarily hardwired into your brain.
Yeah, they're not animal nature necessarily. Right?
They're not necessarily animal nature, but there are things that they have found that very much are animal nature. I mean, we are able to perceive perfect and perfect harmonies. We can hear that because the vibrations, they don't beat against each other.
Right.
Yeah. So when you're tuning an instrument, you know when it's in tune. It stops beating. So we're actually able to perceive these things. Now, whether we perceive them as harmonious or beautiful, that there's a lot of discussion on both ends of that. But the point is that we're able to perceive it. And also, there are lots of examples of cultures where harmony and melody and things like that are of a consistently important value. And they've found, for instance, bone flutes that are 40,000 years old. people in caves were playing bone flutes. I don't think that they were playing, Note Rose by Schoenberg.
Right.
You know, they were probably playing melodies that appealed to them within whatever culture that they had, and they were probably repeated melodies. Just because there's only so much buffer that you can put in your head
Right.
in terms of what you can remember and continue. So there's that. So there are certain physiological aspects of music that do not congrue to this kind of idealist notion of what constitutes music. This does not mean that stuff like Schoenberg and Webern and Berg and Cage and Stockhausen, all that is bad. Not by I listen to it all the time, but it does mean that it places that kind of music in a specific history, and that reminds me of something that I remember Steve Reich talked about, where he said his music was informed by his experience. Okay, so his experience of World War II was growing up as a kid and, being shuttled across the country on trains.
Mm-hmm.
So for him, the train was perfect. It was this machine. It had this repetitive thing. It got him to see his mommy, and then he went back home, and then he went to go see his daddy, and then he went back home, like across the country with his governess, like every year. And so for him, technology and what the world was about was very, very different from somebody who grew up in, say, I don't know, a bomb shelter in Dresden.
Right. Right.
Okay. For him, the experience of being alive was completely different in where he was in New York and California than it was for somebody in Germany. And so you saw the critics, like, say, Adorno, who was also a composer, they fled Germany because it was a horrible, horrible place to live. It was fascist Nazi hellhole. They come to the United States, and so they're looking at the century, in this kind of angst-ridden, as what should I call it, like the brown gloom of angst or something like that. Mm-hmm. And there's that. And that's what they were talking about. So like Adorno said, how can you write poetry, after Auschwitz? It's an ugly thing, and it's a good question. But so for him, the whole thing was, the overturning of the tradition, the overturning of the common era of composition, from the expansion of all possible chromaticism into the full chromaticism of human. Of the composer's human expression, and that was the reigning ideology of serialism and atonality, all through the 50s and 60s, and that's why minimalism had such a hard time in the 60s, because it's tonal, it's repetitive,
often it's pretty,
and it's parts of it are pretty, exactly, and so it's the exact opposite of everything that Adorno and Schoenberg and all these cats were talking about, and so that's a very important shift. And so I think that now, when we look back, we can see that the 20th century atonality was very much a product of that 20th century industrialism and that kind of alienation that created. It made perfect sense. Something like some beautiful some beautiful piece of melody doesn't really belong on the vision of Hiroshima.
Right.
Watching all those people being exterminated from the air under a giant cloud, you don't think of Grieg, It's like, you don't think of Brahms, but at the same time, that was 70 years ago, so now we have, we have moved on from this. And so now I see questions of atonality and serialism as simply ways of working. It's just another tool that one can use in order to express a particular emotion or idea.
Well, it's kind of interesting the way that happens, though, how movements end up becoming techniques, which eventually end up just kind of becoming more of a craftsman-like tool rather than a movement.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a very complicated and messy discussion, especially if you look at somebody like if you, especially with someone like Adorno, because he hated jazz. I mean, he absolutely despised it, and I just think he just didn't understand it. But that's my take on it. I think he fundamentally misread what this. And one of the things that I really love, it was from that kind of weird and frustrating thing by Ken Burns, Jazz. Yeah. Him and Marsalis put that together. Is that Marsalis says something really interesting, which was that jazz is very inviting. You know, it opens the door and says, "Come on in, have a seat, and let's get together." You know, it's a very inviting kind of music. You know, if you listen to something like, I don't know, Kontakt by Stockhausen, that's not an inviting piece of music.
Right.
You know, it's a very uninviting piece of music. It's saying loud, dissonant noise, run away, be afraid kind of thing.
Yeah, it's almost like I dare you to sit through this, right?
Well, yeah, I guess you could say that. Some people actually enjoy that kind of thing. I've had my moments, but you understand though, this isn't an emotionally opening piece of music. It's a cold and it's analytical and it's all that kind of stuff. It's all that kind of affect, as opposed to jazz, which has this kind of opening and friendly and humane kind of affect. And so it's just a different way of doing things. And so with something old and something new, I'm sort of taking all of these things, like minimalism, aleatory, glitch, and I'm just sort of throwing them into a big, blender, and then pumping puree periodically to see what comes up.
Well, so I hope that the listeners can kind of see why I enjoy, and I've always enjoyed my discussions with you, because you are really open to exploring, not only why you choose to do things, but what might be some histories behind it, what might be some perspectives, and what are your peculiar personal perspectives. In my podcast, I generally ask people to give us some of their background. I'm especially curious about yours, because even before you went off on your quest for an MFA and eventually a PhD, you've been this person. You've been a person with an encyclopedic knowledge of many kinds of media art and the people behind it and the techniques behind it. Where did all of this come from?
Well, that's funny. Basically, when I was about 15 years old in high school, you have like one of those typical like teenage moments. It's like, where am I? What am I doing? Who am I? The who am I question was answered pretty quickly. I just said, well, who's asking? And well, okay. Okay, next. So what am I doing? Where am I going? And so I thought about, what I'm good at. And what I was good at, and still am, is art, fine art. And so I basically self-identified as an artist. And the more I dove into that, the more I realized that, especially at this point, because this would be like in the early mid-'70s, art was just exploding. You had conceptualism and all this kind of stuff happening at the time. And that was amplified when I went to art school. I went to first I went to School of Museum of Fine Arts, where I studied actually electronic music, which was fun. We had a couple of VCS threes, and then I went to university, and that broadened it. But in terms of like those kinds of things that kind of nail things down, and I drive back as far as I can, so I can think. When I was just a little kid, my mom and I went to go pick up my dad. He worked at a factory in North Brunswick, New Jersey. We lived in Edison. And so we drove down in the family station wagon. And we were parked in the parking lot waiting for my dad, and my mom left the radio on. And the song Telstar came on by Joe Meeks and the Tornadoes. And I was like, wow. This is the coolest thing ever, ever. And in some ways, I still feel that way. And so that music, that really, that got inside my head, that song. And I was just like 3. I was like this little kid. And that sort of stuck with me. And then when I was about, 7, Bob Moog was on Captain Kangaroo, and he had a synthesizer, and I thought that was really cool too. And he was making all these kinds of crazy abstract noises with it, and playing little cute sounds and like little synth things. And then around the same time when I was in kindergarten, my parents had on public TV or PBS or something like that. I forget what it was. But anyway, there was a special on abstract expressionist painting. And my dad looked at it. It was all Jackson Pollock and Franz Klein and this kind of thing. And my dad was like, "Duh, look at that. Hey, Henry, you could do that." And I said, "Well, gee, what is that?" He's like, it's abstract painting. It's this new stuff. And I'm like, cool. So the next day, we had painting class in kindergarten. So all the other kids painted like little, houses and bunnies and stuff like that. And I was just sitting there smacking paint down. And at the end of the whole thing, the teacher went around and we had to talk about our paintings. And this girl said, "Well, this is my kitty, and this is my doggy, and this is my mommy, and da-da-da." And they got to me and they said, "Oh, Henry, what's this?" And I said, "It's an abstract painting. I like Franz Klein." The teacher about plotzed. She was just, oh my God. And I had her completely flummoxed. She just did not know what to do. So that sort of stuck with me because it meant that I had done something that they just didn't know how to deal with. And so I should investigate this. And so I kept up with that and I went through. And then another important influence was this woman named Allison Steele. She was a DJ on WNEW FM in the 60s and 70s. And she came on 10 o'clock at night and she had the hottest, sexiest voice. Oh, it was like amazing. And she would come on, "Hi, I'm Allison Steele, the Nightbird." Like this kind of, she had this beautiful deep voice. And I'm like 12.
Right.
So I'm like, yay, this is exciting. Ooh, because my dad had these headphones, these old Koss headphones. So I put those in. I would listen to her. And every time she came on, her first hour was the most experimental, freaky, weird stuff. And it was totally awesome. And so that's where I learned about Tangerine Dream. That's where I learned about Terry Riley. That's where I learned about King Crimson. That's where I learned about, all that kind of stuff. It was all through her show. And so that steered me in another direction. And so it's all these little things that came together over the years. And then when I was 15, as I said, I decided that I wanted to be an artist. I don't know what that meant economically, but I knew that that was me in my own personal identification.
Right.
And it just went from there. So that's kind of how I started finding these things. And of course, as technology changed, I just simply adapted to it. I knew that as an artist, I would need to have some kind of a day job because, a lot of my work was always pretty conceptual anyway, and you're not going to make a living doing that. So I always had to have a good day job. And so that's how I ended up, working at Apple, Macromedia, Napster, all those jobs were because I had to survive and I didn't want to, sling coffee.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
So that's something.
as part of doing those jobs and stuff, you were also then kind of tied into some of the early incarnations of community on the internet, and
Hmm.
that's where I first met you. Is this wacky world that ended up latching itself to the band the Severed Heads and Tom Eller's work in particular.
Right.
Um, but it became a lot more than a fanboy list for Tom Eller. It
Hmm.
became sort of one of these little kind of nano communities of people that kind of talk smart in a certain way. They
Hmm.
would get together occasionally, but not very often because not everybody liked each other all the time. But in the end, it developed community in a way that never could have been expected, right?
Right. And I attribute that to Tom and Stephen, no relation Jones. Those two are the people who put that community together, really, and allowed that and used the what was then new technology, these email lists to be able to make that happen. Of course, the content was provided by you and me and LX and everybody else on the list, but I really think that it was the vision of Tom Ellard and Steve N.R. Jones that really kind of made that happen. They were really very. Tom is still like years ahead of so many people, and he's doing what I'm doing now, which is really funny. He's teaching.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I've been following his blog entries. I don't really interact that much anymore, but I follow the blog entries, and it's really amazing to see how, if nothing else, it's always fun to see him denigrate people that want his old work just prior to repressing his own work. Go Tom.
It's Tom's a great guy. But he's in an interesting position, because he's not really Mr. Severed Heads anymore.
Right.
He's very much Tom Ellard doing his new thing.
Yep.
And so it's kind of he must be in a very odd position. I know that he opened for Kraftwerk a couple of years ago, and so they did that. And but I haven't been able to follow his blog just because I just like got a million billion things to read.
Right.
But I get email from him. Sometimes I get email from Stacy. So they're very much around me. I just haven't been able to follow him. I also know that he's head of school or something, or head of department or something like that, where he is now.
Yeah, I don't know the whole story, but
Yeah,
it seems
so
pretty convoluted. And the idea of having Tom Ellard as your schoolmaster in some way is just perfect. I have to admit. So.
yeah, but he's a great guy. I really, those were wonderful times. I really loved it, like stuff when he would shut the list down. That was when it got exciting.
Yeah.
Because we kicked him out of the band
Right.
and replaced him with a little robot that shoots sparks out of its mouth. And then we started listing. I think it finally got killed because we started listing everything on our desks.
Yeah, that's the kind of navel gazing that would get up his skirt. That's for sure. So.
That was too funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, those were wonderful things. And yeah, I was also part of that. I was also part of the Empire list. And God, what else? The Rhizome list.
Right.
And all of those things.
Rhizome, yeah.
And I was part of all that stuff. I didn't necessarily write anything for it, but I would always read it.
Right.
And same thing with like the microsound list.
Yeah, that's what microsound and lowercase. I was part of those lists, but if I posted more than once or twice, I'd be surprised. I just liked surfing those lists and watching people talk about their work.
Yeah, I agree. I was, yeah, exactly. And it was also fun to see the ideas go by because I have my own ideas, but I just, it's a question of bandwidth, like how
Right.
much time do you want to spend, barking about your ideas? It was a lot easier to just go on Severed Heads list and say, okay, coffee cup, piece of dried mango, a box of Planters nuts, blank CDs, my laptop.
Right. Well, now my a question for you though is what's happened to? I mean, from my perspective, I don't really see communities like what that Severed Heads list was like. Creative people mouthing off, and actually every once in a while. So we did things like we did the remix remake
Yeah,
compilation
that stuff was
album.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, and we a lot of times would share our work. A bunch of the ideas that became the creative synth site kind of were first talked about in that context and amongst those
Mm-hmm.
people. And I don't really see environments like that, if for no other reason than now every environment has its own 10 websites that everybody goes to and they don't go to any others other than that.
Mm-hmm.
And people are living a lot more insular life. I mean, I was prior. I got drawn into the Severed Heads thing because everybody there was fascinated with the religion at Kankar,
Mm-hmm.
and whose leader at one time before he was ousted was named Darwin Gross.
I know, that's so funny.
Yeah, I know. And half of the people on the list that saw me posting assumed I was that Darwin Gross. And so it was just a great howl or laugh, right? And that was
It was a
fun.
riot. It
And
was,
I actually got introduced to more of Severed Heads other than just the couple of tunes I had heard.
yeah,
Um, I got introduced to the whole catalog because I got slurped into the community, right?
right.
Um, I don't see where those things exist because, like right now, one of the things I'm really into is the modular synth thing. Well,
Mm-hmm.
modular synth stuff, you spend almost all your time at Muff Wiggler. Eventually, you go touch base at electromusic.com. Once in a while, you go over to a place like Gear Sluts, just so that you can come back to Muff Wiggler and say, "Oh, those people over there are just wacky and stupid," right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's about the extent of the community. Be, there doesn't seem to be.
I think you can find these things on, oddly enough, Facebook.
That's
There's a
true.
lot of those kinds of groups on Facebook and also in Tumblr. And Tumblr is more, I don't know, it's more personality driven.
Right.
But Facebook has all kinds of groups that cater to specific interests, and then it's just a question of people posting things that they find interesting about that, and then maintaining an interest through posting. So, for instance, one of my things is one of my day jobs was as a graphic designer. Hey, I went to art school, so I did a lot of CD covers over the years,
Mm-hmm.
and so one of my favorite groups was this thing called shit record covers, and the SRC page on Facebook was where everybody would just post the ugliest, stupidest, most ignorant, dumb, oh my god, make my eyes hurt, bad design record covers.
Right.
And it was great until people just started posting lots of pictures of naked women
Right.
on these covers. And of course, when you have a list with 15,000 people on it,
Yeah.
somebody's grandma gets to see that her grandson, posted this to this list, and she gets incensed, complains to Facebook, and the whole thing got shut down.
Yeah.
But they're back. I mean, it's a small group now, and they're very strict about what gets posted. But the point is that it's there. These things do exist. There's another group that oh, was it for I grew up in Edison, New Jersey, so there was this group for the old Menlo Park Mall. Okay, and people would say, "Yeah, you remember that Chinese food place next to the bagel joint? You know, does anybody ever eat there? You know, and everybody gets to reminisce, and it's all these old geezers like me talking about, yeah, you remember Bambergers? You know,
Right.
like that kind of thing." And so there's that, you know, and then so these kind of like little communities of nostalgia or memory, you know, this kind of social shared memory get some kind of form in these groups in Facebook. So Facebook is kind of useful that way, and it could, and it all. But as I said, it depends on people being at least one person being dedicated enough to keep posting stuff to it on a consistent basis, because otherwise the algorithm of Facebook will just simply zero it.
Sure.
And it'll never appear in anybody's feed.
Right. So I have a question based on something you just said, which actually resonated throughout this whole discussion. I mean, we've already blown through our hour. It's amazing. But I want to ask you something specific because I think you might have an interesting insight on it.
Mm-hmm.
You just said that this list about the old Menlo Park Mall was a bunch of old geezers reminiscing about the good old days, right? Mm-hmm. There actually seems to be a bit of a thread, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I mean this more as a thought, of a lot of what you do, either talking about the past, touching base with the past, or actively rejecting the past in some way. It's almost like everything that you're doing has some attachment to history in a very specific way. You know, so the library project is, you know, really an homage to the pre-printing press library systems in a way, right?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think
your musical pieces, because you manipulate samples in particular ways, and then you kind of you reuse old work of yours and you reuse work of other people as starting points for your stuff. Also has this history, and then also even the communities you interact with have a certain amount of history baked into them.
I think that's kind of I think there's two things to that. One, actually more than two, there's several, but one thing would be, I think, in my own view, we're all products of history and we live in time. And so we kind of have a responsibility towards the future by being conscious of our past. So this way we have a richer and more valuable present. So I think that's one really important thing. Another aspect is that if you don't know where you've been, then you don't know where you are, and if you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're. Then anywhere you go, it's just fine.
Right.
It's just because it's just corner's as good as another, and so that's why history is important that way. It's very important to have a sense of where you've been and what you've done. And there's that. The other thing is that I think that's just a product of the times that we're in. Mark Fisher, the theorist, he's been talking about that in his book Capitalist Realism, which I think is on Zero Books or something. He talks about how we're in a society of permanent retro. We're always looking back. And he had a really interesting lecture, it's on YouTube somewhere, where he talks about how there hasn't been really that much musical innovation since like the mid-1990s. And how some switch went off like around like 1994. Excuse me. And so we're now in this new kind of place, this kind of neoliberal world where everything is exploitable, and so I think that's part of the thing too. It's this whole postmodernist approach. I actually talked a little bit about this, I think, when in Creative Synth, in one of my articles about the mellotron, and how there's a difference between the mellotron and the synthesizer. The synthesizer is this machine of the modern era. It's the voice of the industrial world. It's the voice of the Frankenstein monster. It is artificial musical life. And so for that reason, because it is this kind of heroic device, there were places for it that were being made for it in the classical canon. So you had the theremin, the Ons Martineau, all these different synthesizers. And then, of course, that was capped with the victory of East Coast synthesis in 1968 with Wendy Carlos's, Switched on Bach, which was directly opposed to the West Coast synthesis of Subotnick and his Buchla with Silver Apples of the Moon. So there's these kind of warring parties within the system. But the point is that this system itself was this victorious, triumphant synthesizer, this original voice of the machine.
Right.
The mellotron is exactly different, not opposite, but just different. It's a nostalgic machine. It plays off of tape recordings, and these recordings they're never in tune. They're always slightly off pitch, and because the tape is so thin, it always kinds of warbles, and it doesn't really have a very fixed tuning and pitch and speed and tonality. It's this weepy, weak little instrument, and so it plays on your memory of a sound.
Right.
See, so when you hit a flute sample, you're not hitting a synthetic flute, which comes ex nihilo out of the machine. You're hitting a key that plays a tape of a recording, which is a mechanical memory of a flute. So as a consequence, the mellotron is actually the more revolutionary device in a way, because it goes against even the modernist principles of originality, of unique voice. It's this sad, nostalgic, plaintive machine, and so as a consequence, it never found its way into the orchestra. It couldn't. It's exactly antithetical to an instrument. It's not an instrument. It's this weird hybrid device, and so I think that the kind of postmodernism that became so de rigueur of the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s was premised kind of like on this notion of the mellotron. We live in a kind of a mellotronic society where nothing is what it is. It's a copy of something else that's been processed. It's this, and it doesn't appeal to your sense of victory or your intellectual sense. It's not mathematics like a synthesizer. It appeals to your emotions. It doesn't try to lead you. It convinces you by being your friend.
Right. That's actually, and that does, that in a way kind of speaks to this idea of things becoming ever nostalgic, because in a world where everything is in overabundance, media-wise, any way that you can convince people that you're already a friend probably helps pave the way for it being accepted, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's kind of funny. So like now, even with our new synthesizers, they're wavetable machines, basically. RAM is so cheap that you don't have to have like this mathematics, creating some waveform. Right. You just sample the damn waveform.
Right.
And you're done. It's all good. So it's this weird. So in a way, the synthesizer has caught up to the mellotron, but all it's done is just recreate the tape deck. In that way, it hasn't really gone off to do some brave new thing. And of course, there's all these new synthetic systems of arriving at new sound. Whether it's like all these people have different systems. Like whether it's a granular blah 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 blah, modeling sense,
Right.
all that kind of stuff. That's interesting in and of itself. But the question is like say with a modeling synth, yeah, it may be out of the machine of the synth, but what is it doing? It's modeling something that already exists.
Right.
So it's kind of becoming a mellotron, even though it's just a synthesizer.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating. I really I want to write something about that and in a more extended way. I have like an article. It was in Creative Synth back in 2000, but I really want to take that and run with it and do something else with it because I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think it has some legs.
That's a really cool way of thinking things. Now, the other question I have though about history, because you are a professor,
Mm-hmm.
you're a teacher and a filler upper of young minds. How do you introduce people to history and that kind of stuff without making it sound like an old coot trying to get people to get off their damn yard? How do you prevent history from seeming irrelevant?
Well, one way is to explain things to help students see themselves as historical actors and give them agency. That's really critical. And oddly enough, that's by giving them the history behind something adds weight and power to their agency. So I can say, okay, kids, go do stuff. Here's the tools, go make things.
Right.
And they'll all pretty much make the same thing. It's and they'll do this year after year after year after year. But if you show them the history of things behind something, then they start understanding that there's a power to what they're doing and that there's a strength behind them. It's the weight of history. It's this giant, huge thing. And because it's so huge, you're never going to get the entire weight of it. All you can do is find your way through it. But so I do that I have a class in sound synthesis that I teach. So I'll have the kids learn, how to do musique concrète. Now we don't have tape decks, so I force them to use Audacity and make them pretend that it's a tape deck. And so they get to cut sound up and edit it into a form. And so this way, and then we listen to stuff like Schaeffer, Pierre Henry, Delia Derbyshire, Philippot, Edgar Varese, all this kind of stuff. And then they hear that, oh, this has been done before. And it could be done in a really dissonant way, like Edgar Varese. Right. Or it could be done in a very consonant way, like Delia Derbyshire. Right. And so they can say, oh, okay, so this is where this comes from. And then they see why our tools look the way they do. I mean, why do we have these long streaming timelines? Well, it's a visual cognate to tape. Yep. So we can work that way. And so they learn about that. And then we go to the next phase of synthesis and sampling and blah, blah, blah. And all the way along, I show them stuff like the mellotron. And I don't have one, but I can show them videos of how the mellotron works. And there's actually a film called Melodrama. It's all about the mellotron. So we watch sections of that, and then we watch sections of the movie about theremin, for instance. So that, you could build these things. And so when they see someone like Clara Rockmore play a theremin, it's mind-blowing because she's the movie was made in the 1990s, and she was in her 80s or 90s then. She wasn't young. Right. And so this gives them a sense of, wow, a connection to the past. Then so it gives them weight, and by giving them these tools, this history, they can then go forward and do things. It gives them not only the aid, they already have the agency. I push them out the door to do that. They have agency, but this agency now has power. It has focus and it has weight, and that gives them reasons to be interested in the history of stuff.
Right. Well, this has been a fascinating and fun conversation. Henry, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
No problem, man.
For people who want to see some of your work in action, where can they go on the net or even in person to see what you do?
Well, let's see. In the end of January, I will be in Berlin, and I will be part of the Transmedial exhibit. I'll be in the same room with Dead Swap, run by Telekommunisten. So I'll be there. I'll also be performing, I believe, probably that Friday at Werkstatt, which is a space in Berlin. I will. You can always friend me on Facebook if you want to find out what I'm doing. I always keep things there. I have a website. It needs to be updated more often, but it's called kether.com, kether.com, and I keep a lot of my older music there. And my new stuff is available through Auricular Records. So that's Auricular Records. Anyway, go there and you can order my record there or download it as MP3.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Cool,
and,
man.
Have a great day, man.
Cool. See ya.
Bye. And there it is, Henry giving us the tour of the entirety of media arts. It's pretty hilarious the way that he is able to kind of skate from context to context with complete ease. Love it. Thanks so much for listening. As always, I appreciate everyone's great listenership. Our numbers are fantastic, but the numbers don't matter as much to me as capturing some of this great history and being able to share it to you. Please feel free to drop me a line at ddg@cycling74 if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or ideas for podcasts. Otherwise, I'm out of here for the week. I'll catch you next week. Thanks. Bye.